For 4 centuries, their name alone struck fear across the vast expanse of the American West. The Apache, a relentless force, carving out their existence in a territory that now spans multiple modern-day states and a nation. From 1500 onwards, they were the specter haunting the southern plains, a constant, looming threat to anyone who crossed their path. How did this nomadic group of hunter-gatherers become one of the most formidable and feared peoples in history? The Apache were among the most formidable Native American groups to instill apprehension in the Old West. Various Apache bands migrated into the southern plains region around the year 1500. For the subsequent 400 years, they constituted a palpable menace to all populations in their vicinity. Apache groups traversed a vast territory that encompasses present-day Mexico, New Mexico, Texas, and Arizona. Initially, their societal structure was that of nomadic hunter-gatherers. Even in this early period, they proved to be formidable neighbors to other indigenous groups, equipped with bows, war clubs, and notably supported by packs of trained dogs, which aided in hunting and likely in conflict, making their presence a source of trepidation. Their arrival marked a significant shift in the power dynamics of the region, as their adaptability and martial prowess quickly became apparent. They did not build permanent settlements in this early phase, but rather moved with the seasons and the migration of game, their understanding of the harsh landscape providing a natural advantage. This constant movement also made them an elusive and unpredictable force for any who might seek to control or displace them. Their societal organization, based on kinship and fluid bands rather than rigid tribal structures, allowed for flexibility and rapid response to changing conditions, whether environmental or hostile. The acquisition of the horse transformed the Apache from feared neighbors into legendary figures of the plains. They obtained these animals through a combination of trade and aggressive raids on Spanish settlements, demonstrating a keen understanding of the horse's strategic value. Apache individuals rapidly mastered equestrianism and integrated the horse into their combat doctrines. By the 1600s, Apache-mounted warriors were conducting persistent harassment raids against Spanish colonial outposts. Their primary advantage was not numerical superiority but speed. Apache raiding parties seldom comprised more than a few dozen mounted warriors. This limited size contributed to their agility, allowing them to materialize, strike, and vanish from a raid location long before Spanish, Mexican, or later, American authorities could muster a response. The objective of these raids was resource acquisition, livestock, weaponry, food, and captives, not necessarily prolonged engagement or territorial conquest. The raids were engineered for swiftness and employed brutality only when deemed necessary to overcome resistance or ensure escape. If confronted with unexpectedly strong opposition, Apache raiders possessed the tactical flexibility to disengage and withdraw, although such occurrences were relatively infrequent due to their careful selection of targets. Apache bands were meticulous in choosing objectives, avoiding confrontations where they did not possess a clear advantage or high probability of success. Apache warfare, when engaged, could be exceptionally harsh. Practices included the killing of adult male prisoners, the taking of women and children as captives, and the torture of captured enemy combatants. Victory, and the acquisition of resources or vengeance, was the paramount goal, often overshadowing notions of honor that might be found in other martial cultures. For instance, attacking a downed or surrendering enemy was considered a sound tactic if it could lure the enemy's comrades into a disadvantageous position, thereby creating further opportunities for the Apache. While the Apache conducted reconnaissance of potential targets, they were generally less inclined towards extensive, prolonged scouting compared to groups like the Comanche. A defining characteristic of Apache raiding tactics was their transient nature. They did not linger after a successful raid to occupy territory or publicly claim the site. By the time Spanish or other retaliatory forces arrived, the Apache raiders intended to be long gone, melting back into the vast, familiar landscape that served as their sanctuary and operational base. This hit-and-run methodology, perfected through generations, kept their adversaries in a constant state of anxiety and made effective countermeasures exceedingly difficult to implement. The Apaches' period of dominance on the southern plains proved finite, largely due to the arrival and ascendancy of the Comanche. Emerging from the north after 1700, the Comanche, like the Apache before them, swiftly mastered equestrian skills and developed into highly effective mounted raiders and warriors. The ensuing rivalry between the Apache and the Comanche became deeply acrimonious, with bands from both groups frequently clashing over contested territories, hunting grounds, and access to resources, particularly bison herds. In these direct confrontations on the open plains, the Comanche demonstrated superior horsemanship and developed large-scale mounted warfare tactics that gradually outmatched the Apache. Comanche warriors, often operating in larger, more cohesive mounted units, systematically pressured Apache groups, progressively dislodging them from the coveted grasslands of the plains. This displacement forced many Apache bands to retreat into the more rugged, mountainous terrain and broken landscapes of the Southwest. Within these mountainous regions, the Comanche's equestrian superiority was somewhat negated. The difficult terrain favored ambush tactics and dismounted combat, areas where Apache warriors traditionally excelled. The broken country, with its canyons, mesas, and dense vegetation, allowed Apache fighters to utilize their skills in stealth, tracking, and surprise attacks to greater effect, thereby leveling the playing field against the Comanche cavalry. This shift in environment led to a change in Apache tactical focus, emphasizing guerrilla-style warfare rather than the open-field mounted engagements that had characterized their earlier period on the plains. The conflict with the Comanche was a crucial turning point, reshaping Apache territorial distribution and their methods of warfare. Apache male children were molded into warriors from their earliest years. Their nomadic lifestyle inherently conditioned them physically and fostered a deep attunement to their environment. This natural conditioning was augmented by specific exercises, including rigorous running and swimming regimens. A favored training technique, still utilized by special forces units globally, involved running with a mouthful of water to enforce nasal breathing, thereby enhancing endurance and stealth. Children's games were designed to impart warrior skills. Wrestling and foot races were daily activities. A prevalent game known as creep and freeze taught boys to approach one another undetected by remaining absolutely motionless when under observation. A warrior who mastered complete stillness could effectively become invisible in plain sight within the broken, hilly terrain characteristic of Apache territory. This method of concealment proved as effective against American soldiers as it was against Apache playmates during training. United States military accounts consistently remarked on the Apache's ability to hide with ease and to materialize as if from nowhere. Instruction in the use of the bow and sling began as soon as boys were physically capable. As they matured, the war club and lance were integrated into their training. One historical scholar noted that a properly trained 14-year-old Apache boy was as skilled and dangerous as a regular soldier. More critical than proficiency with weaponry, however, was the installation of obedience. Deference to the wisdom and authority of elder warriors was paramount for a boy's survival and his education in the ways of the Apache. Around the age of 15, a youth might be selected as an apprentice on the warpath. This apprenticeship involved learning a specialized hunting and raiding language, distinct from everyday speech, to ensure secrecy and clear communication during operations. Throughout this intensive training period, apprentices were permitted to drink water only through a special tube and to scratch themselves only with a designated scratching stick, these acts serving as constant demonstrations of discipline and obedience. An apprentice was required to survive and participate effectively in 4 separate raids to be considered a fully initiated warrior. Attaining the status of a full warrior conferred the right to participate in future raids, to marry, and to have a voice in the band's councils and decision-making processes. Those who failed in this rigorous training and initiation process were often ostracized, viewed as outcasts within the community for the remainder of their lives. This uncompromising system ensured that only the most capable, disciplined, and resilient individuals became Apache warriors, forming the bedrock of their formidable martial reputation. The cultural emphasis was on practical skill, endurance, and an unyielding commitment to the collective, values instilled through a lifetime of shared experience in a demanding environment. As the 19th century dawned, the Apache found themselves caught in a vice of shifting political tectonics. Mexico achieved independence from Spain in 1821 and soon entered into conflict with the expansionist United States over control of Texas. During this period, both Texas and the Apache shared a common adversary in the Comanche. Apache warriors, recognizing a mutual interest, fought alongside Texan forces during their war for independence. This alliance, however, proved to be ephemeral. Following the annexation of Texas by the United States in 1845, a significant influx of American settlers began to encroach upon and claim Apache lands. From the Apache perspective, after having rendered aid to Texas, this was perceived as a profound betrayal. Consequently, Apache bands actively resisted the encroaching settlers. The American viewpoint, however, largely categorized the Apache as just another savage indigenous group that needed to be cleared from the land to make way for American expansion and settlement. Under these circumstances, the possibility of peaceful coexistence rapidly diminished. Peace was no longer a viable option. The ensuing Apache Wars spanned a tumultuous 40-year period, involving numerous engagements between various Apache groups in the United States military. Each Apache band had its own distinct history and leadership, with some leaders and groups intermittently seeking peaceful resolutions, while others remained consistently engaged in warfare. Despite these internal variations, nearly all Apache groups shared a common tactical approach when confronting their technologically and numerically superior American adversaries. This approach was born out of generations of asymmetric warfare, first against the Spanish, then Mexicans, and finally the Americans. The core of their strategy remained the exploitation of their intimate knowledge of the terrain, superior mobility in harsh landscapes, and the ability to strike unexpectedly and dissipate before a concentrated counterattack could be mounted. The political complexities of the era, with shifting allegiances and the relentless westward drive of American manifest destiny, left the Apache with increasingly fewer options to maintain their traditional lifeways and territorial integrity. Throughout the 19th century, the bow and lance remained staple armaments for Apache warriors, though firearms became increasingly prevalent. The utility of firearms, however, was constrained by the constant need for gunpowder and ammunition, resources the Apache could primarily acquire only through raiding parties that could, in turn, return fire. Consequently, the acquisition of firearms and ammunition evolved into an increasingly critical objective for Apache raiding parties. Attacking settlements defended by armed men became an ever riskier proposition, thereby restricting their viable targets more and more to isolated ranches, vulnerable wagon trains, and poorly defended encampments. Engaging the United States military presented a different set of challenges compared to warfare against other Native American tribes or civilian settlers. Against the superior firepower of organized U.S. Army units, traditional Apache hit-and-run mounted tactics proved less effective. Horses remained indispensable for rapid movement, reconnaissance, and swift escapes, but their role as primary fighting platforms diminished against this new type of enemy. Instead, Apache warriors adapted by using their horses principally to scout enemy movements and to rapidly position themselves for dismounted ambushes. They would wait patiently, often in carefully selected, advantageous terrain, until American soldiers moved into a predetermined killing zone. At the chosen moment, they would unleash a sudden, concentrated volley of arrows and gunfire. Critically, they would then withdraw before the American troops could effectively organize a cohesive response or bring their superior numbers and firepower to bear. Apache warriors, conditioned to extreme endurance, could cover distances of up to 100 miles in a single day if necessary, making pursuit by slower-moving American infantry or even conventional cavalry exceedingly difficult. These adaptive tactics proved devastatingly effective at the Battle of Cieneguilla on the 30th of March, 1854. Approximately 200 Apache warriors successfully lured 60 U.S. dragoons into an ambush within a narrow canyon. A small group of Apache fighters made themselves visible to a detachment of dragoons and executed a feigned retreat. The American soldiers, believing the Apache had misjudged their strength and were fleeing, charged forward. This charge led them directly into the concentrated field of fire of the main body of 200 concealed Apache warriors. As the surviving Americans attempted to withdraw, they discovered additional Apache fighters had positioned themselves on the high ground behind them, cutting off their retreat. Of the 60 U.S. dragoons who entered the canyon, 22 were killed and another 23 were severely wounded. The Apache devised numerous methods to harass and disrupt their numerically superior adversaries. A favored tactic involved severing the copper telegraph wires used by the American military and replacing the cut section with a piece of dried rawhide. The rawhide blended effectively with the appearance of the wire, making it difficult for American repair crews to locate the actual breakpoint, thus delaying communication and frustrating military coordination. In direct combat engagements, Apache warriors were trained to identify and prioritize the killing of officers and scouts, aiming to maximize the disruptive impact of each casualty on enemy command, control, and intelligence gathering. Over the subsequent decades, the U.S. Army engaged in dozens of such small-scale skirmishes and battles with various Apache bands, a protracted and brutal war of attrition across the southwestern territories. Among all Apache groups, the Chiricahua proved the most consistently effective in their resistance, largely due to a succession of exceptionally skilled war leaders. These leaders orchestrated numerous campaigns against American forces, campaigns that solidified the Apache's formidable martial reputation. However, throughout these protracted conflicts, the inherent limitations of traditional Apache tactics, when confronted with a technologically advancing and numerically superior adversary, became increasingly and starkly apparent. Cochise, following a wrongful accusation of raiding in 1861 that shattered a fragile peace, emerged as the first of the great Chiricahua leaders during this era of intense conflict. He was a master of the ambush and lightning warfare tactics that had long served the Apache well. With the United States government and military increasingly preoccupied by the American Civil War, Cochise leveraged this distraction to press his warriors into even bolder attacks against U.S. military detachments and installations. At the Battle of Apache Pass on the 18th of July 62, his well-laid ambush initially gave the Apache a significant advantage. His warriors inflicted casualties on the American soldiers before the troops were even fully aware of the Apache presence. What Cochise and his men were unprepared for, however, was the deployment of American artillery. The U.S. troops maneuvered howitzers into position and began shelling the Apache ambush sites with devastating effect. While Americans had previously struggled to effectively deploy artillery against the mobile Apache in rugged terrain, advancements in artillery technology and battlefield doctrine finally allowed these weapons to be brought to bear. Cochise and his warriors were forced to withdraw, having sustained heavy losses. This engagement profoundly impacted Cochise. He subsequently avoided large-scale direct confrontations with American forces, eventually surrendering in 1871. The firepower advantage of the U.S. Army had grown substantially, and this trend would only accelerate. Future Apache leaders, such as Victorio and Geronimo, internalized the hard lessons from encounters like Apache Pass. They understood that sustained, direct engagement with American troops would lead to annihilation. Consequently, guerrilla warfare, characterized by swift raids and evasive maneuvers, became their only viable strategic option. This stark imbalance of power seemed hopeless to many Apache, which explains why a significant number chose to settle on reservations rather than continue what they perceived as a losing fight. By the 1870s, most Apache men possessed firearms, typically Springfield or Winchester rifle models, often a generation or two behind the weaponry employed by the U.S. military. The sale of firearms and ammunition to Native Americans was illegal under United States law. Therefore, the only means for Apache warriors to acquire these essential tools of war were through the black market, or by capturing them in raids. This created a perilous cycle. The Apache needed to conduct raids to obtain weapons, which were necessary both for further raids and for self-defense against the inevitable American retaliation those raids provoked. In the 18th of August 79, the Chiricahua Apache war leader Victorio led approximately 80 warriors off the Ojo Caliente Reservation in defiance of American plans to forcibly relocate them to Arizona. The Apache understood at this juncture that their choice was stark: fight to preserve their way of life, or submit to what they viewed as the slow cultural death of reservation confinement. Victorio chose to fight. For the next 14 months, Victorio's band, which grew as others joined him, campaigned across Texas and Mexico. His warriors were well armed with rifles and expertly mounted, representing the culmination of centuries of Apache mastery in these forms of warfare. At its peak, Victorio's war party numbered around 200 fighters, one of the largest single Apache forces ever assembled. Yet, he meticulously avoided a pitched battle, knowing it would likely result in a massacre. However, the American and Mexican military authorities had also adapted their strategies. Recognizing the futility of attempting to directly chase down the elusive Apache, they opted for a strategy of containment and attrition. The Americans deployed thousands of additional troops to garrison every known waterhole, trading post, and potential arms cache in Texas and New Mexico. Victorio found himself unable to strike any target of significance without risking a major engagement. 2 centuries prior, bison hunting could have sustained his force with relative ease, but bison populations had by then dwindled to less than 1% of their former numbers. While the wilderness still held numerous oases and water sources, the ever-increasing number of American settlers had claimed most of them. The era of Apache freedom to roam and raid at will was long past. Victorio was reduced to conducting small-scale raids on isolated ranches and settlements, actions that served more to infuriate his enemies than to sustain his force. His warriors began to desert, his numbers dwindling as he retreated from Texas deeper into Mexico. Mexican forces eventually tracked Victorio and his remaining approximately 150 warriors to Tres Castillos in northern Mexico in the 18th of October 80. Aided by recent autumn rains, the location formed a natural oasis surrounded by 3 rocky hills, which Victorio likely viewed as a defensible refuge for his weary band. The Mexicans, however, managed to surround them before Victorio was fully aware of their presence. The Apache fought throughout the night of the 14th of October, using the rocks as natural fortifications against the Mexican soldiers. It was precisely the type of static defensive battle that Victorio had striven to avoid. Apache tactics had always relied on speed and surprise, and at Tres Castillos, Victorio possessed neither. Even if he had, his warriors lacked sufficient ammunition to withstand a prolonged siege. When the smoke cleared on the morning of the 15th of October, Victorio and most of his warriors lay dead. They had, quite literally, fought until their last bullets were expended. Victorio's death at the Battle of Tres Castillos was a watershed moment. Never again would the Apache gather a war party numbering more than a few dozen. The Chiricahua produced one more celebrated Apache leader in Geronimo. He had lost his mother, wife, and 3 children in a massacre by Mexican soldiers in 1851, an event that fueled a lifetime of animosity. He spent 30 years raiding targets in both Mexico and the United States before being forced onto the San Carlos Reservation in 1885. He escaped one last time with a band of around 30 warriors. In many respects, Geronimo's warriors were the epitome of Apache fighting skill. They were masters of firearms and guerrilla tactics, exhibiting the incredible speed and stealth that had always made the Apache formidable. Thousands of U.S. soldiers were deployed to find them, yet Geronimo's small band remained elusive for months. Ultimately, however, these tactics were no longer sufficient. The United States possessed too many soldiers and too much firepower for such a small group to pose more than a localized threat. The methods that had once made the Apache the scourge of the southern plains now merely rendered them a persistent but manageable nuisance. Geronimo could only harass undefended settlements and meticulously avoid even the smallest engagements with the U.S. Army. Unable to secure enough food or ammunition, Geronimo fled south into Mexico. His warriors gradually deserted him as he moved, mirroring Victorio's final campaign. When American representatives made contact in 1886, there was simply no longer a viable reason to continue the fight. The Apache Wars concluded not with a decisive military victory for either side in a conventional sense, but rather with the quiet surrender of an old weary man and his few dozen remaining followers. Geronimo's final capitulation in 1886 marked the effective end of large-scale organized Apache armed resistance. His warriors, and he himself, recognized that they were fighting to preserve a way of life that, under the overwhelming pressure of American expansion and military might, was no longer sustainable. A few isolated Apache raids were reported as late as 1924, but these were sporadic incidents without significant strategic consequence, the last embers of a dying conflict, rather than a reignition of the widespread warfare of previous decades. In the aftermath, Apache people largely settled onto designated reservations, primarily in Arizona and New Mexico, or gradually assimilated into broader American society. The vivid, often brutal stories of their warrior past, their resistance, and their ultimate subjugation were relegated to the pages of history books. The remarkable speed, equestrian mastery, and sophisticated guerrilla tactics that had made them legendary figures of the American West were, in the final analysis, insufficient to preserve their autonomy or prevent their confinement to reservations. The sheer demographic weight, industrial capacity, and technological superiority of the United States proved insurmountable. The ecological changes, particularly the decimation of the bison herds and the increasing scarcity of water resources due to settlement, also played a crucial role in undermining the traditional Apache economy and their ability to sustain prolonged resistance. Nevertheless, the warrior past of the Apache was not forgotten, not even by their former adversaries. The United States military, in a tradition that continues, began naming attack helicopters after Native American groups renowned for their martial prowess. Among these is the AH-64 Apache attack helicopter, a direct acknowledgement of their historical fighting abilities. During a ceremony in the 11th of March, king the rollout of a new version of this helicopter, a traditional Apache blessing was even offered. This gesture was widely interpreted as a mark of respect, a recognition of a warrior heritage that Apache people themselves continue to remember with pride. The narrative of the Apache Wars serves as a complex chapter in American history, detailing not only conflict and conquest, but also the extraordinary adaptability and tenacity of a people fighting for their existence against overwhelming odds. Their story continues to be told, studied, and remembered, reflecting the enduring impact they had on the history of the American West. The Apache story is one of profound adaptation and enduring spirit in the face of immense historical pressures. Their history provides a compelling look at cultural survival. What aspects of Apache history do you find most compelling or surprising?